Or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap. This is going to be a great one, folks, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to listen to it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And of course, we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's webinar you have a question for our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Then also at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 3 lucky winners. Okay, with that, we'll kick off today's webinar, which is Keys to Successful Cohabitation, Governance and Autonomous Teams. Our speakers today are Jeff Keyes, who is Vice President of Product at Plutora, and Helen Beal, who is multi-talented, multitasking, many titles, including DevOpsologist at Ranger4, Chief Ambassador and Product Owner at the DevOps Institute, and an analyst with Accelerated Strategies Group. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining me today.
Morning or afternoon.
Morning, afternoon, evening, yes. Jeff, I think you're going to be kicking us off today.
I am, and
okay.
You know,
I'm gonna put myself on mute.
Plutora does a number of webinars on DevOps.com, and this is another just huge treat. If you haven't heard or read from Helen, you're in for just a lot of great insights. I remember, Helen, the first time we met, and I was blown away at the number of companies, the amount of backgrounds you had from all aspects of dealing with environments and companies transitioning to DevOps. And this topic is kind of a mouthful, but I'll tell you the topic is super relevant. So walk us through what we're going to talk through today, just a bit.
Thanks for the intro. Hey, no pressure. But yeah, I remember our first such a great chat. And I was so excited to find Plutora and everything that you guys are doing. So yeah, what we're going to do today, we are going to look at why autonomous teams and centralized governance can live together, so how that happens. But importantly, how organizations actually evolve from a place where they might only release, a couple of times a year, maybe once a quarter, to a place where they can do it frequently, perhaps, once a sprint to begin with, and then maybe a bit more frequently until it's on demand, and do that very safely, so have a very low change fail rate, very a lack of incidents, so no need to be worrying about our MTTR, hopefully. We can actually look at, I don't know how many release managers we've actually got on the call today, but we're actually going to talk about what actually happens to that role as we proceed to these new models. And that's not just interesting for those people that have those jobs, but of course those people that run these resources, and these people and these teams want to know what to do with their people as well.
Right.
And then we're going to finish looking at the tech that is going to help us support all of this and help us make decisions that are informed about the risks we're about to take.
Yep.
Yeah.
And well, this takes us right in, which is, what the heck are autonomous teams, and do they live together?
Really.
What are autonomous? What does that mean, anyways?
Well, an autonomous teams means we don't have silos. So let's go back a little step further. So if we go forward one slide and think about why we actually have a requirement for autonomous teams. So what is the situation that's led us here? We can ask ourselves the question, why do we have release managers anyway? Why is that a job role that's required? And really, that's because we have this situation where over many decades, systems have evolved. Multiple systems have been developed and bought and integrated. So we have these situations where we have very complex, sophisticated and integrated and tightly coupled environments. So pejoratively, we often call a big ball of mud or spaghetti code. So,
right.
Customers see this beautiful interface and they love interacting, and behind the, in the back, it's like it's magic, or it's a black box, or it's swans, swans gliding along the surface with their feet madly paddling underneath. So we've got hundreds of thousands of people globally that are trying to keep these very complicated and fragile systems up and running. So if we go to the next slide.
Well, one question on this. I mean, Helen, because you're doing a ton of consulting with different companies, how common is this? How frequently do you see these big applications that are, pretty messy backs on the backside, that lots of dependencies and so forth?
I mean, it is everywhere, and it's tempting to say that it is a problem for larger enterprises with a longer amount of history. But I've worked with plenty of companies that have been 15 years old or so that still have this problem, because it's kind of it's like a sprawl. So in terms of architectural design, we used to architect things in very large ways, kind of monolithic ways. We'll kind of cover this a little bit, but we try and now architect things in smaller ways, in the same ways that we want smaller autonomous teams, we want smaller bits of code and all of that kind of stuff. But this is how it's happened. I've been to see 2 customers just today, one this morning, which is a gaming company, and we were talking about their kind of model agile DevOps team. And one of the guys dipped in and he said, well, they are a true autonomous team. And I said, what do you mean they're a true autonomous team? And he said they basically don't have any system dependencies with any other team.
Right.
Pretty much every other agile team that they've got in that organization shares another platform. So they all have an interconnection and a tightly coupled dependency on a shared system, which makes their life complicated.
Which makes it a lot harder to do the transition to DevOps, and managing those dependencies is the problem.
Totally. And then this afternoon I've been to see a very large food manufacturing company in the UK, and they've been telling me about how they are consolidating 12 ERP systems, and they've got to 4 and they want to go further, but all of those ERP systems are connected. So what tends to happen is we change something over here, and we've done all our testing, we think, and we've done integration tests, regression tests, whatever, and then we deploy the change, and then something unexpectedly and unpredictably broke somewhere we completely didn't imagine it to happen. And we're trying to get around this and make things smaller and more predictable, but it's hard to transition from a monolithic architecture to a microservices architecture. So our release manager's purpose generally is to protect us from that catastrophic failure. So what they're trying to do generally is coordinate those dependencies for us, which is what you see as well, right?
That's exactly right. That's the world that we got started in, one of these monolithic applications where the release managers were trying to do this manually, and so they were running around having meetings, lots of spreadsheets to the dependencies, and these big, huge releases that they kind of go crazy, and it's been a tough world for them. But is this all about the systems, the applications, or are there people, process, tools? How does this work with the other side of that discussion?
So yeah, great question. So people wise, what we have traditionally built for all the right reasons, because we wanted to manage IT as a cost center, we siloed IT as we evolved it over time. So many organizations I work with are 100+ years old. So there was a time pre-IT that they existed in. So IT used to be back office, we used to be order takers, so it made sense to split us into SME silos essentially. But what that led us to from a process point of view was a waterfall essentially. So big batches of features that we would go through very large phases until we got to deploy, and then we would deploy a very large packet of features at once. And this makes this situation worse, right? Because we've introduced a whole other level of unpredictability, because now we've just released 50 changes in one packet. Something's broken. We have to try and unpick which of those 50 things was it that did what. And our industry we often use research from aviation and from healthcare, because they are equivalently complex industries, in that when something goes wrong, the root cause is not usually one very obvious thing. It's normally a succession of things that happened in a chain that were unpredictable, that led to that final thing that broke unexpectedly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure you've seen lots of war stories about this, where things have gone terribly wrong. And I mean, that's why we're having this conversation. So,
Yeah.
so becoming loosely coupled, I guess that's kind of the direction we need to come, because all of this, in order to actually get there, we've got to get to this loosely coupled system. So walk us through that.
Well, we need to become loosely coupled from both an organisational perspective and from a systemic perspective, because what we want to try and do is move from big bang, large batch to small item incremental change. And we do that for a number of reasons. One, it removes risk, because we're only betting one small thing, not one big thing. It also allows us to get feedback much quicker. It's much quicker to do one small thing than one big large thing made of 50 things that we've all linked together. So we get much faster feedback. Systemically, it's much easier to test and deploy quickly on a very small piece of software. So this is Conway's model. So Mel Conway said that, you know, we design systems that look like our organizations. So when we had organizations that were highly hierarchical and had lots of silos within them, we developed systems or monolithic systems that look that same way. So what you're seeing here on this slide is actually something from Holacracy. So those people that are listening that are not familiar with Holacracy, is an agile organizational management system effectively. And it follows many of the same principles that you'll be familiar with from agile ways of working and DevOps ways of working. So what we're seeing on the left is that these hierarchies are somewhat of an illusion and somewhat unhelpful, because the relationships kind of don't work. And you can see the person at the top's got a really big happy face, and the people all at the bottom that are kind of doing all the work and actually are usually our customer sensors, most importantly. So they're the people that are actually getting that direct feedback from our customers, are all really unhappy because they're all really burned out. What you see on the right is a holacratic representation of an autonomous, empowered organization. So it looks much more like an organism. You can see there are kind of like a cellular element of it. So if you think about the human body and how, you know, the brain is a really important organ, but it can't operate without the heart, can't operate without the liver, can't operate without lungs. Everything is working much more together in a holistic manner, hence the holacracy from holistic and democracy. So
love it.
We're trying to move from these silos, which silos are a nightmare because they create lots of handoffs and delays. We're trying to move to a place where organizations think like this, and this is really key, think like value streams. So a value stream is any product or service, and we want people to think and act like they care about where that idea is incepted, if that's the word, the inception of that idea, all the way through its life as a piece of value in that value stream to the place where the customer is receiving value from it. So our definition of done kind of changes, doesn't it, Jeff?
Yeah.
It moves from a job to, yeah.
Totally does. It totally does. You know, it makes me think of words that are, you know, I've heard of a teal or a generative organization. What is that compared to this?
So one of the best books about holacracy is a book called Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux. And he proposes a number of different colours of organisation, and teal is his most forward-thinking organisation. We use this a lot at Ranger4 when we're having cultural conversations, and we use it alongside something called the Western topology of organisational culture. And I think actually, if you look at the Accelerate State of DevOps reports, I think they were using Western and may have moved to Laloux this year. And Westrom, again, healthcare researcher, identified 3 levels of cultural capability. So there was pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. And then there are different kind of topics or themes you can think about. So for example, if you think about messenger being a bearer of bad news, in a pathological culture, those messages would tend to be shot. In a bureaucratic culture, but with quote marks, not unless it's the mafia, just kind of, you know, metaphorically shot. In the bureaucratic culture, they tend to be isolated, and then in the generative culture, they are trained. And everyone always says to me when we do this exercise, because I get people to think about their own organisation and how they treat people, And they always say, well, what does it mean to train messengers? And I kind of talk to them about Scrum and, you know, what happens if you have something goes wrong. Do you have an event that you might talk about it? And they're like, oh, well, in the daily stand-up, we talk about impediments. I'm like, da-da, there you go. That is being trained to deliver bad news. So yeah, so there's all these different models that we can look at. And the basic help is to quantify culture. And this is a big part of DevOps, right? We've always known that culture is one of the things that makes DevOps stand out from a lot of systems that we've looked at before. But because we're technologists and we talk about bits and bytes and not emotions and feelings, it's often very hard for us to give context to what we mean when we say culture. So the work that West did and the work that Lalu has done actually gives us a framework to have a discussion about how our culture looks like comparatively.
Yep, that's exactly right. So, which kind of takes us to one of the problems of getting there. You know, as we go forward, it's like, that's great. Let's go decompose all these applications. Let's make them. We've all been told that. So why haven't we all done it? And one of the challenges, I think, is, you know, regulatory compliance. A recent talk that I heard, Neil Burton at Gartner talked about the average number of external regulations that DevOps teams must comply with. On average, 3. And the challenge is if they don't, you know, I forget what the actual fine is if you get dinged with GDPR, but it's not insignificant. And you know, if you don't do these things right and get audited and you know, bad things happen. Companies liable, financial implications, could be you know, a broader risk and customer confidence loss. So this is a big deal. My analogy to it is it's somewhat like giving the keys to the, you know, I got a teenage daughter, gave her the car keys when she first started driving, and boy, it's a little bit worrisome. Yeah, she's autonomous. That's awesome. She can drive herself. But if she gets in trouble, I'm liable. I'm the one that, you know, pays the bill and the ticket and everything else. And in the same regard, that's the problem that is faced by larger enterprises as they have more autonomous teams go forward. It's great. Go be your own product, tool, whatever. But at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, that comes back on the company, and it's a big deal. You know what? What do you see? What do you see with your customers when they're dealing with regulations?
I love your car keys analogy so much. But yeah, it's so true, right?
It is.
We create these kind of idealistic models. I used to use words like nirvana and utopia, and I stopped using them because they kind of, it's a bit like using the word unicorn. They're all kind of mythical. But you know, there are companies that do exist in the States that we talk about, you know, Ben and Jerry's, and as you know, read reinventing organizations. There are lots of organizations that do operate in that way, and if you talk to large organizations, you'll always see pockets that are managing to work in that way. And what we've really got is this fourth revolution that we're in the world. We've got a whole world of people that are moving from one way of working, waterfall, traditional ITIL, to another way of working, which is agile DevOps and autonomous teams in incremental ways. But it doesn't switch over overnight, because there's a bunch of humans that need to practice it and a bunch of considerations like the regulations and GRC as a whole that need to be considered. So I always talk about regulations in kind of 2 terms. One is what an organisation does when they are given a fixed date, when they have a number of things that they need to do either for a new or an updated regulation, and then what I call continuous compliance. So what a product or feature does on a day-to-day basis to make sure that they're not in breach of any of the regulations that the organisation already knows about. So with the first scenario, there's often this kind of fallacy that you can only deal with a fixed date by dealing with waterfall, because you've got a fixed date, and you must therefore do a planning session, and then you can do your design, and then you can do your development, and then you can do your testing, and then you can go into your release and deployment phase. And I have seen for real with some of the banks I work with in the UK that is not the case, and you can use agile methodologies to break the work down into much smaller pieces, get working very quickly, get feedback very quickly, and get a lot more done, be a lot more confident by the time you hit that final date than you would have been had you done the traditional way. And a lot of this is supported by tooling. We're going to cover quite a lot of that towards the end, but the automation part of this becomes even more important with that scenario you just talked about, your teenage daughter. We've got your teenage daughter now. We want to give her the car keys, but we want to make sure she's safe as well. So, you know, we might want to put some automated controls around what she's got as well. You know, we might want to put some monitoring in the car, you know, not Big Brother on her, but just to make sure that, you know, some safety checks aren't being missed. We might even want to put a speed limiter on the car, you know, make sure she doesn't go too fast, maybe set some guardrails about, you know, where she's allowed to go and at what time of the day. You know, you don't really want to drive in 400 miles at midnight, that kind of thing. So it's getting that balance. But yeah, you know, regulation it's huge, and it's only getting heavier for any company I work with, and it's not something people really enjoy doing very much.
No,
generally.
it's not, but necessary. And I'm so glad you have empathy for my job as a dad. So moving along. So we're going to talk about, you know, how to actually evolve, and how do we get to, given all these things, how do we get to what we just talked about? Which, you know, takes us through to talking about some of the reasons for it, and some of the, you know, talk to us about really lead time and how it impacts.
So yeah, I referred to the fourth industrial revolution and the whole global market moving from waterfall to agile and DevOps ways of working. We talked a bit about holacracy, you know, we haven't talked about lean yet, but I'm sure it'll come up soon. But you know, what is the reason that any of us are trying to do that? Well, the fourth industrial revolution really is about all the technology that's been emerging since the 1970s. We're at the turning point at the moment. You know, a great future, golden age lies ahead of us. But for many organisations, they're struggling with the digital disruption. So, you know, in the UK, the banks will talk a lot about things like Monzo and Starling and Revolut. You know, different industries have different competitors. You know, we're all aware of Uber and Airbnb, and people reinventing models using the global network. So what organisations are really trying to do is figure out what it means in order to be a high-performing organisation. What the State of DevOps reports have told us year on year for many years is that to be a high-performing organisation, we have to have a high-performing technology organisation. And we have two key sets of metrics. So the first set of metrics is our throughput metrics, and these can tell us a lot about how well an organisation is operating, and therefore how well they're going to be able to compete in the future. So the deployment frequency here is key. What you can see is that elite performers are deploying much more frequently than low performers. You know, no surprise to anybody. Lead time changes. Again, we are getting that value to our customers much faster in these elite performers. And lead time changes here is defined as from code committed. So we can have some big conversations, and we do, about where we measure lead and cycle time from. You know, is it code commit? Is it in sprint backlog? Is it in product backlog? Is it even before that, when somebody in the organisation had an idea, have the whole fuzzy front end conversation? But yeah, here are two of the metrics that people are trying to understand. And from remembering this webcast about release, we can see how they're linked to the release part. And if you've got a release manager who's running a calendar that says you can only have a slot every 3 months or every month, we can see how it's going to be difficult to get into the elite performer area. Again, with the lead time for changes. We've got a blocker or a cadence that's being dictated by our release management team, it's going to influence our lead time. So that's going to stop us getting to elite performer. And those stability ones that you were just looking at, so the next set, the time to restore service and change fail rate. This is the stuff that the release managers need to know, that DevOps is really, in these ways working, is about. So there is often this perception that what we're trying to do with these new ways of working is make things faster, and we are, but not to the detriment of making things safer and more secure and more compliant and all of those things. So it's really important that we share this stuff with release managers. They know that at the same time of trying to release more frequently and trying to get that value into our customers' hands faster, we're also trying to make sure these systems are more stable. So we are doing things like testing earlier, we're having more monitoring, we are doing infrastructure as code to make our production systems more predictable, more consistent. So all of this stuff's going on as well to support that. So this stuff should make the release managers, as they work through the organisation with the evolution, more confident about opening up release slots, for example, and saying, well, I can see that team over there. They've been showing me that they can deploy to that staging environment with very few change fails. I've seen that they've automated 90% of their unit tests. So, why don't I let them try a small change one day when we know everyone's here, and see how that goes, and start experimenting to build this confidence over time that that transition to the fully autonomous 25-year-old daughter that now has bought her own car and can go wherever she likes without dad needing to know about it at all, it's fine.
Yep. So
yeah.
that takes us to the world of how do you, evolve the service management side of this conversation, and what happens, because as we do this, as we're releasing more frequently, a lot more smaller, walk us through that. What happens?
Yeah, so all these 5 things are really connected. So these are kind of the key ITIL or ITSM processes we're talking about that need to be lighter weight, that often get in the way when we're trying to speed up that deployment frequency and change cycle time, but they're all trying to protect us. We need to remember that. And from a release perspective, what the traditional ITIL environment tends to give us is release weekends. And Jeff, I'm sure you know customers that still have release weekends and release nights.
Mm-hmm.
It's still a very, very common pattern, and it's really painful, right? I've worked really hard not to work at weekends. That's not my plan to do that. And having all these release calendars and these release managers seems kind of wasteful potentially, and it's like an extra overhead.
Yep.
So we need to take these steps. So, I've just put the 3 columns here. The one in the middle is more frequent automated releases. So what most people will start doing here is typifying or typifying releases or changes. So they say, look, actually, this is the really small change. It's something we do commonly. So we can make that like a standard release, and we can give that a different process. So we can, either have less cabs involved, and this is how it relates to the change piece. And we can have more freedom to deploy that release ourselves, and over time they earn the right to do it. And then we also talked about system, tightly coupled systems earlier. So as we transition, as the teams are able to break dependencies between systems and make systems more loosely coupled, we are able to get to a place where the autonomy is practical from both a people, process and system perspective. But it takes a while, right, to transition between these two. I mean, there are companies I've been working with for 5 years that still maybe only have 5 or 10% of their teams that are getting to that right-hand column yet. And, we can see how everyone else will get there, but it takes a while to get the people ready, to get the processes tweaked, and to get the systems in place to support this, doesn't it?
It does. It's not easy. Well, where are most of the companies you work with? Where are they on this process from in this journey?
It does vary massively. So there are some organizations, I'm thinking like parts of Lego that I was working with 5 or 6 years ago that had quite a lot of this nailed in one particular part of their business already. Some of the banks have got pockets of this that can do it now, and it does depend. Like that gaming company I talked about this morning, that example of the that particular team that's nailing this, and the guy said, yeah, they have true autonomy. If you've got that system autonomy, it's easier to get to this process and people autonomy quicker. And if you haven't, you need to work all of it together. But there is like the State of DevOps reports shows, there are many shades of grey and capability and low and medium and high performers across this. But there is no doubt that this is the way that's moving. If you look at where people were 6 years ago, it's quite different from where people are now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different words that describe this. There's a book out that's popular, the Project to Product. I recently read from a large telco that is hoping to do this in 3 years of making this transition, and the intent is to have more autonomy with smaller teams driving forward. And it's a big change architecturally, culturally, organizationally, in every way, because it's going to enable value delivery to their customers more quickly. But it's the world has changed and everybody's experiencing it, which is presumably why you're listening to this webinar now. So, well, taking this forward, that means if the world is changing, well, what happens to our favorite folks of release managers? If I'm in a decentralized model and with autonomous teams, what do these guys do? What happens to them?
Well, we could fire them all, just like we did with our project managers,
Yeah,
couldn't we?
that would be sad,
You
but
know,
yeah.
it does happen. I have seen it happen. I have seen, I think famously, Maureen McCall from Barclays stood on stage and talked about what happened to her before she joined Barclays, which is exactly that. She got fired because somebody went, well, we're going agile, so we're going from project to product, so therefore we're not doing projects anymore, so therefore we don't need project managers anymore. Which is kind of dangerous logic, because as we've just established, as we just said, this stuff takes time. There's a lot of humans to bring on board. There's a lot of people and technology that needs to change, and it will change over time. And an organization, not everyone changes overnight. You'll find pockets that are more advanced than others, and it's like a kind of, it just shimmers across an organization as the capability evolves from team to team to team. So it's very dangerous, I would say, just firing those people that have enormous amounts of knowledge about how the business works and important things like what regulations we need to comply to. I've seen a really interesting pattern actually in one of the big banks I work with, where they had project managers assigned to their product squads or teams, which I kind of squinted when I looked at it the first time. And then what we kind of discovered when we dug a little bit deeper is actually the project managers were almost working as scrum masters from an impediment removal perspective. So they were effectively driving the breaking of dependencies across the organization and removing their impediments. And in very large organizations that have huge amounts of bureaucracy, why would you not want another pair of hands helping with that? Because it's important. So yeah, we don't do that.
It sort of reminds me when I first heard, that talk at Google Automate when he came out on stage and said all, test is dead and it's completely gone. Well, you know what? It hasn't really gone away. In fact, the role has changed, and it's almost like the role of release management is, it just has to evolve. It has to go forward in the organization to do better. That's really kind of the whole point is there needs to be an evolution. If you're a release manager listening to this, or you have a release organization listening to this, I hope you're taking away a message of things are going to change. And in order to keep your job relevant, if you try to keep doing the same thing you've been doing, it's not going to work well for you. You need to transition. And maybe you can kind of walk through some of what this transition means. What does this look like for release management as an organization?
It's so like project management, and this was inspired actually by Maura Slider in her talk, The PMO's Dead Long Live the PMO. But it's like what happens to leaders as well. As we move to having autonomous teams that are working in a way that means that they're empowered and authority has been distributed to them, and they're, one of their most important functions is being customer center. Those people that have been guiding or controlling them in the past kind of moved from that kind of admin role to more of an advisor role, really get to grips with automation tick in the DevOps world. They can no longer afford to be seen as a blocker, but those breaking of those dependencies that I was just talking about becomes much more critical. Coordinating and administrating stuff will be automated in the future, so they need to become the coach and collaborator. Like a leader needs to move from controlling and managing people to a place where they help people discover things. The release manager is the same. They're not an enforcer or a gatekeeper, but they're an involver and enabler, and they move away, like a project manager is mainly involved, or in the old world more interested in things like budget and milestones and things like that. What we really want to move is, again, the focus on value. So thinking like a value stream, being concerned about the definition of being a definition done being when the value is in a customer's hand.
Yep, exactly. And having the tools that they can actually do that versus trying to, that's where the value is going to come. So we'd have to talk about the flavors of release managers, because there's different kinds of release managers and people get confused. When you just say that, it's like, well, wait a minute, what do you really mean? Because my perspective is only one area.
Yeah, so this is where we came to this, isn't it? These three different ones. I'm actually going to start with the physical one, because that's kind of the first one I sort of met. So often actually in environments, release manager, very technical person. So around 10 years ago now, sort of as I started to become familiar with DevOps, was via a deployment automation organization I used to work for. And I found myself going to talk to organizations about automating deployment, obviously, but the people I was talking to were very, very clever technical people that clearly one day got very bored of performing the same manual task over and over again. So they'd written some scripts.
Right.
And then they more scripts, and then they'd written more scripts. And over time, they'd created what I used to call a script monster. So I used to go in and meet these people and say, well, how do you automate at the moment? And they'd say, well, John does it. He's got this automation that he's built out of ant scripts or whatever. And I'd go, oh, okay. And, is it very reliable? Is it quite quick to run? No. Is it very scalable? Can lots of people know how to do it? No. So would you like something that was more reliable and more scalable? And John would get very upset at this point because I basically just called his baby ugly. And not only that, I'd kind of taken away his security blanket, because he was the only one that knew how to do this, because he built it. He was the guy that when it broke, he would, he was kind of Brent off the Phoenix project. He'd come in and save the day when the release went wrong at 2 o'clock in the morning, because he knew how everyone worked, or everything worked. So you get that type of release manager who's hugely technical, who's like really hands-on in the release. You get the kind of production-only release manager who's much more of a kind of a calendar function, that admin function. The team requests the slots, they schedule it, they kind of look at the conflicts to try and avoid having catastrophic failure relating to dependencies. They'll kind of say yes or no, and they may be there when the actual release goes on. And then we've got the end-to-end release manager who's much more closely aligned to the team, maybe even sits in the team, but can definitely see the team schedule backlog. So maybe isn't running their own schedule, actually has visibility into the team schedule, and actually actively participates in the work planning. So, if they're doing Scrum, some of the sprint events like sprint planning, so they can actually, they have knowledge and participate into what's going on with that team. So we've got those three types. Any other types? I think those three we came up with.
I think those are the three I see most of all. So, and I love this thinking, because where to go next is really cool. And what options do you have?
Yeah, I mean, so many options. And this is as hard maybe for release managers as to project managers, who kind of this feeling when the company organises or announces that they're going to be doing agile and wondering what on earth they're going to do next. They're going to be out of a job. It's very frightening. Same as IT operations people, we're going to go cloud. Suddenly the IT operations people that manage the data center get very concerned for what's going to happen to them. But there are plenty of options to develop a career in these new ways of working. So if you're a production only type release manager, you might want to consider the kind of Scrum Master portfolio manager roles, which are kind of much more event coordination and overseeing, large interconnected pieces of work. If you're into end-to-end, so you're quite team focused, you like visibility, you might want to consider something like product owner role. If you're very, very technical, so that kind of physical release manager, something like an SRE, so site reliability engineer or cloud engineer, would probably really suit you. Learn about infrastructure as code and elastic scaling and all sorts of wonderful things like that. But all of them could also be a value stream manager. So Jeff, what is a value stream manager?
Well, funny you should ask that. We so often focus on just delivery. We forget about the delivery isn't about delivering story points. It's about delivering actual value to the customer, and looking at that value is what's important. And yes, you're going to understand the product very well. You're going to look to coach not just individual pipelines, but all pipelines, because you have to deliver value, which isn't just a single bit of code that comes out. You want to make sure it's adopted. You want to, at the end of the day, be able to use metrics to show that you're delivering value, that software has been adopted and utilized, and there's net promoter score to do that. The only way to really gain insights into what's happening is you're going to have to use tools. And those tools give you the ability to see what's going on and to and do that across the board. You know, you won't be able to do this manually. You're going to have lots of autonomous teams, and so as that role of managing value streams, you're going to be manage them in mass. And as you manage them in mass, you need to be able to gather and automate the delivery. You need to be able to gather enough information that you can handle the audits. Now you become really valuable to each of the individual autonomous teams, because you now can answer the key question of audit for them, and they can sort of take that off the plate. You can act really as a valuable coach. And what that ultimately allows you to do is to, you know, shift left and right with both the quality and compliance and really the value delivery, to make sure that from inception to cash, you're providing the greatest value to the company using the teams and tools that you've got in place. But I always had the question, Helen, you know, is that real, a value stream manager? You
So
know, what?
I work with actual organisations who have reorganised around value streams specifically. So, you know, they have squads and tribes and communities of practice and things like that as well. But the primary organisation level they are working with is the value stream. So this is becoming big. This graph here has been, we have kind permission from DevOps Institute to share this with you. It's from their soon to be published 2020 upskilling report. But at the bottom here, you can see that product value stream lead or value stream manager is becoming an actual job title or job role that people are hiring. So there is definitely a movement in the technology industry to embrace value stream thinking and build organizations or construct or, you know, reorganize around the value stream concept. So the idea from idea to cash or idea to realization. So this is happening. It's only likely to get bigger. It's very closely related to lean. I promised we'd talk about lean. So any of you that have done value stream mapping will probably know that it's one of the Toyota canon of tools. So, you know, came from manufacturing in the 1950s. We're only really learning how to use mapping in the technology world now to great effect. It's happening. I've been doing value stream mapping now for at least 5 years, if not 6 years, with my customers, and it's, you know, it's where I often get them to start when they're thinking about what they want to do with these ways of working, because it's such a great way of visualizing where the waste is and where the blockers are in a value stream, so with that ultimate view on the cycle time. So I think it's real. What do you think, Jeff?
I think it's very real. We're just dealing with. I think what is funny is maybe the title isn't nailed down exactly, but they're working on it now, and I'm starting to see value stream manager come more into play, and seeing more folks looking at the actual value delivered. I think that's only going to get more. Just recently, Gartner came out with an article as they sunsetted the application release orchestration Magic Quadrant, came out with a new critical capabilities and bit of research about how to actually manage DevOps teams. And what's interesting is they look at the autonomous agile product team. They came that there's, you know, 3 ways forward for those teams of using tooling and organizing around kinds of platforms to help manage that. And so that they effectively categorized all the tooling that will be involved in DevOps products as in 1 of 3 buckets. They're either going to have a value stream delivery platform, or you'll have a value stream management platform that'll hook into the rest of the tools, or you'll have just niche DevOps tools. So the terminology is now moving forward. Who actually manages the agile product teams? Well, that's going to be the value stream managers, and as they move forward. But it's a transition. It's a transition that companies have to go through as they learn to evolve through this, as they're, you know, evolving every part of this. And maybe you can kind of walk us through this, you know, going from the old world of, you know, looking at the people process tools to the new world, and what does it actually mean?
Yeah, you know, it takes time. we've talked a little bit about transition already. What we put on this slide really is thinking about what it takes to get from this big batch waterfall approach to the small increment agile approach. So from a tools perspective, we're moving from a really manual place where we're using spreadsheets and email and MS Project and Gantt charts. Starting in the middle, we're starting to do value stream mapping, and with things like continuous integration and delivery are starting to emerge. And whilst I'm a huge proponent of continuous integration, continuous delivery, I'm also a massive proponent of end-to-end DevOps tool chains, which really incorporate both that kind of fuzzy front end and also the value realization elements. And so incorporating service desk and monitoring and incorporating portfolio management. So when we're starting to talk about that, we're really talking about value stream management. So we're talking about end-to-end from idea to realization. And then from a process point of view, we kind of covered this already, but moving away from the release calendars and weekends, but starting to increase transparency into the backlogs and people's release plans, and getting to that autonomous place where we have the automated governance and continuous compliance. And metrics wise, metrics is a really tricky one for all of my customers. So without exception, they really struggle with it. They struggle to choose the metrics, they struggle to get the metrics out of their systems, and they struggle to regularly measure and actually utilize the metrics.
Yep.
And one of the things I think that's really misunderstood is that as you go through the journey, the metrics that are important to you will change. So deployment frequency is not interesting anymore when you can do it on demand.
Right.
But like cycle time and your customer value outcomes, once you are deploying on demand and your MTTR is really fast and your change fail rates really low, is suddenly the thing that's really interesting. And one of the, actually, again, this morning with the gaming firm, we had one of those conversations which I love, which was where the lights went on, where they realized that if they had small autonomous teams, despite the fact that they couldn't visualize a time when technology would own the profit and loss of the P&L, I suddenly realized that if they were able to measure the cost and the value and the ratio between those two things for each feature team, they were actually effectively running a P&L. And if they had the data to do that, then they had quite a lot of influence over what investment was made into that product.
Which is kind of the point.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, what a concept. Have a great cost and profitability analysis for each team. That's exactly where the planning has been proposing for so long, yet no one from the PMO organization has ever come back to actually measure. Well, we said we were going to make this much by doing this investment. Did we actually? How much did it actually cost? And no one knows because the metrics haven't existed. And like we find most of our customers are actually on this beginning, journey of the manual side, moving more to the right. And if you find yourself there, don't be sad. The point is to take your release calendar for the release weekends and create more or transparency into those backlogs and improve, give more opportunities for those releases, standardize them, and use tooling to help you get there, and use the metrics to prove that you're more effective. That's the whole point. And that kind of takes us to the next discussion, which is, well, there's got to be some tools and technology to help us as we transform the organization. And well, yes, there is. That's why we're here. But when we talk about managing value streams, is you need tooling that helps you do it. And really, it's going to combine with the organizational changes that you'll make and the process changes that you make to get there. Forrester really coined this and drove forward in the industry about 1.5 years ago with the wave that they released, and defined value stream management as the combination of people, process, and technology that maps, optimizes, and visualizes and governs the business value flow. That's what value stream management solutions do, and they're available for really any team to get started wherever you are in your DevOps journey, with the intent that if you start now, you can now prove that specific teams have done better than others, and prove that those teams that are adopting these practices of becoming more autonomous are more effective and are higher performers. You already have that as a roadmap because it's been defined before, and there's a lot written on it that you can follow. Plutora is a solution. This is exactly what we do. We help siloed teams improve their scheduling. We have standardized release templates that enable the delivery. We help the governance because we standardize and abstract away that governance so that we can verify that any pipeline, whether it's manually monitored or if it's already included into the pipeline itself, we can verify that that's happening independent of the methodology that's being used. We can manage the risk across the pipelines independent of the level of automation that's there. And that helps the whole process. We can help the manage the progress of change. And ultimately what it looks like is you have to get down to some of the metrics that you can see and provide across the organization. And these are some sample dashboards that we have out of the product itself that as you gather the metrics across the pipelines, independent of whatever methodology, you can look at, what are the timings, what is the risk, and give me some insights. For example, the one here on the right is where you can look at various releases and look at the progress that they're having through the path of design. Do they need a change advisory board? Do they not? Has it already been incorporated in the pipeline as an automated step? We don't care. The point is we'll make sure all the right things happen, and you can measure the risk of the deployments themselves, and you can look at it. Also continuing along, you can look at a release risk. You could rate these things as being following the process, not following the process. You can look at them as being in cycle, out of cycle, and just focus on the things that are needed. As a transitioning value stream manager, you can now look at the risk of delivery and ensure the right things are happening. You can look at the various types of releases. You can then ultimately get, the core DevOps metrics of your deployment frequency, lead time for changes, what's your MTTR, what's my change failure rate. You can get all the metrics you want across the pipelines, independent of the methodologies being used, connected up to your tools, and you're good to go. All of this is part of the Plutora value stream management platform. And it is what you need in order to change the story. If you're going to try to do this manually, you'll never, ever get there. If you connect tooling that hooks into the rest of the tool chain, it gives you the opportunity to now have broad influence as the organization changes. And that's why we're having this conversation. The world is changing, and you need tooling in order to manage all these pipelines. So in conclusion, with all of that, I know there's a big transition that's happening in the world to go to autonomous teams. We still have to have governance. So how do we get there? Well, we're going to be changing the people, process, and tools. You need tooling like Plutora to help you get there. You need to transform the way that you're doing your governance, and there are ways to do it as you become more automated. Helen, any final thoughts before we jump to questions?
Yeah, I think this concept that being compliant and being agile are two different things really needs to be called out as a myth. And actually, I took the mickey out of the industry a few years ago because I did a survey called How Continuous is Your DevOps? And then did several talks based on the research that I found called DevOps and all the continuouses. But continuous compliance is a thing as well. Getting those checklists that the release managers go through, and getting the release managers getting all of that process into the team of the people, and automating it using Plutora to make sure that that risk is managed and mitigated is a real thing. So these two things are not mutually exclusive by any means.
Absolutely. Well, questions. There's a number of questions we've got. If you have some questions too that want to make sure we get answered, put them in the chat box. There's a few here. Can you address how to integrate reporting on DevOps and standard projects so that there are common metrics and definitions that can be aggregated for executive consumption? I can take a swing at that. If you want me to take the first swing at that, Helen, or do you want?
Yeah, I think that's definitely you. I think you may have already answered. I think that came in before you just did that bit, but you have a go at that. Yeah.
So that's a great question. That's where the tooling comes in. If you try to build this yourself, you'll be spinning up a whole project to do that. There's you know, there are a couple of open source projects that'll get you, you know, a very tiny way down the path, but quickly aren't as effective as just getting a value stream management tool. The point is that you need something that can integrate across your tool chain, correlate the data together, and then you can pull a lot of the out-of-box analytics. The things that I showed, for example, are key. One more question is, what are the best indicators to monitor for DevOps projects? And I think you talked about that a bit. I'll let you take that one, Helen.
Yeah, so they do change, right? So, and also DevOps, what is the DevOps project? Because remember, we're not doing projects anymore. If we're talking about an evolution to DevOps ways of working, or we're talking about a team that are practicing DevOps principles, because also I don't like the word DevOps or the phrase DevOps teams, which is probably a topic for a whole other webcast. But let's say, what are the useful metrics if you are trying to practice DevOps ways of working? The four that I showed you from Accelerate earlier on are the four kind of key metrics. They're pretty much industry standard. I had a customer earlier on tell me them. So just to recap on what those were, there's two for throughput. One is deployment frequency, the other is lead cycle time, and there are two for stability, one of which is MTTR and the other is change fail rate. Whilst I love those metrics, the one thing I will say is that none of those four relate to value, and that's where we really need to get to. But I'll also reiterate my earlier comment, which was that as you evolve your capabilities, your need for metrics will change. So at some point you'll say, well, our team or our teams are all releasing on demand, therefore we're now in that elite performer category up here. You know, maybe there's another metric we should be looking for. Or you could do it earlier, you could look for value as well. And just to put another couple of bits on what Jeff was just saying, metrics and finding those metrics and presenting those metrics to people. What I see a lot is people building dashboards, and whilst dashboards are useful to an extent, they do not give you end-to-end traceability of the value stream, so you don't get those insights. And there are other things that you get from value stream management tools, like being able to drop in and drop out specific tools. So I was with a group today who've just spent about 9 months trying to get consensus on their CI tool, and they finally decided on GitLab CI, and they're all breathed a sigh of relief. And I just turned around and said, yeah, the thing about that is it really worries me, because now if you need to change that tool in the future, it's going to be like such a big moment for you, kind of emotionally. But if you had a tool, you know, it's still going to be an emotional moment, but it's easier than if you've spent a lot of time doing those integrations yourself. Even if you're using APIs, it is easier if you've got a tool integrating them. And it's impossible with a dashboard to get cycle time out, because all it's ever going to do is look in the different tools you tell it to look at.
Awesome. One last question, then we have to turn it back over. Can you suggest some books, bibliographies, help me deepen these concepts? What's your favorite readings to help me get better up to speed on some of the things we talked about?
I would recommend two books off the back of this content. One would be Accelerate, Dr. Nicole Forsgren, Jess Humble and Jean Kim's book about the state of DevOps reports and all of the metrics and data models that they use for those. And then my other one would be Frederick Laloux's Reinventing Organizations, which will be an introduction to what teal culture looks like and how organizational culture models have evolved over the past 100 years or so. What about you? What would you recommend?
I think those are two good ones. I actually really like the Project to Product book, looking at some of the value metrics of delivery. Kind of reshapes the thinking that's there. But with that, we will, Helen, this has been awesome. And thank you for your time. And we'll look forward to doing more of these in the future. It's a lot of great concepts here, but we'll turn it back over to you, Charlene.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, you're right, Jeff. Great stuff. And I do want to remind the audience that if we didn't get to your question, just know that Jeff and Helen will get a copy of all of the questions that came in, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys offline. Let's see, before we go, I do want to do the drawing for the $350 Amazon gift card. So without further ado, our first winner is Adriana M. Congratulations, Adriana. Our next winner is Eugene C. Congratulations, Eugene. And our final winner today is Sandy D. So congratulations, guys. We'll be following up with you on after today's webinar via email to get you your $50 Amazon gift card. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We are going to be sending out an email following today's webinar that contains a link to access the webinar on demand, and the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website. So hopefully you'll be able to find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Guys, thanks so much for taking the time. Great presentation, Helen and Jeff. Appreciate your time. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.